it's going to be a whole conversation about that, and then we'll wrap up our session. So altogether, we planned this session to be 1.5 hours, but we'll try as much as possible to, to keep it within maximum 1 hour and maybe 20 minutes max, so that we are able to go back and, take note of our responsibilities. Take care of our other responsibilities. So I want to first of all talk about the Eastern Africa Agency and Gender Norms Learning Collaborative. I am sure some of you have already heard about it. Some of you are already members, others it's your first time. But it's a community of practice for social and behavior change practitioners, but also those interested in policy and research. And geographically, we are in the Eastern Africa region, including Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Ethiopia. So those are the countries where the membership is drawn from. And our mission is part of the collective mission for the social and gender norms learning collaboratives globally. We are part of the Social Norms and Agency Learning Collaborative, and our vision is we envision a world where partnerships, knowledge sharing, and thought leadership converge to ensure sustained equity, social justice, and health for all people. And our mission is to strengthen research and practice on social norms and gender norms, whereas including agency by building a network of practitioners, researchers, evaluators, and advocates who share knowledge, generate evidence, and develop resources to support social and behavior change programming. So that's our mission. And I just wanted to talk about the counterparts in the Secretariat. So this learning collaborative has a Secretariat, and it's this Secretariat is managed by 3 co-hosts. Impact and Innovations Development Center is one of them, where I'm seated today, and where Aloysius, my colleague, is from. And then we have Makerere University School of Women and Gender Studies, and CARE Uganda. So those are the 3 co-hosts. And the Learning Collaborative also works in collaboration with the USAID Agency for All project. Basically, the role of USAID Agency for All is to integrate agency into social norms programming. And so to provide the evidence, because this is a research project, so it's providing evidence on the role of agency in social and behavior change programming, but also supporting us with the utilization of that evidence. So that's why we have the Agency for All here, and happy to have them. So I also want to talk about the benefits of joining the Learning Collaborative or being a member. So there is an opportunity for networking and collaboration with other partners in the region, because it's a regional platform. So you don't, as a social behavior change practitioner or researcher, you don't work alone, but you're connected to others, and you can actually learn so much from the rest of the members in the Learning Collaborative. We also have several engaging events and activities. So some of these include virtual events like this one. We also have in-person events of different nature, and basically these events help to, for sharing knowledge and best practices across different organizations and members. We also lead technical discussions and contribute to the regional and global dialogue on social norms and agency. And we are also involved in co-creating resources with other members. We develop joint blogs, technical briefs, and others. And as a member, you gain access to a community of technical experts, not only regionally within East Africa, but also globally, because we are linked to other social norms and agency learning collaboratives in West Africa, in South Asia, but also globally. So we encourage you to join if you're not already a member. You can visit our LinkedIn page with Eastern Africa Social and Gender Norms Learning Collaborative. The link is there. And we're also going to paste it in the chat box for you to be able to refer to it, and straight away you find an online membership form where you can register yourself within that platform. But also you can stay connected with us on our different social media platforms like Twitter and YouTube. We are also in the process of developing a website, which is going to be very interactive, so it will also be added to the platforms for interaction. So without wasting so much time, let us straight away go to the business for today. So we're having a listening session on decolonial feminist research. And I want to first of all introduce our three facilitators. Amon Mwiine. Amon Mwiine is one of our facilitators for today. Amon Mwiine is a lecturer in Makerere University, School of Women and Gender Studies here in Uganda, and his specialty is masculinities and gender and development and sexuality and feminist theory. That's what he specializes in. And that's what also he teaches at the university. And he has a PhD in sociology from the Stellenbosch University, South Africa. And he's also holding a 3-year fellowship program with the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Makerere University. So Amon, you're welcome. Can you wave to us? Yeah, Amon is there, you can wave. Yes. So secondly, I want to introduce Daphine Agaba Kabagambe. Daphine is also a lecturer with Makerere University School of Women and Gender Studies. And Daphine is, prior to this, she has been a postdoctoral research fellow at the Thabo Mbeki Africa School of Public Health and International Affairs, which is affiliated to the University of South Africa. She is a holder of a PhD in public law from the University of Western Cape. And also she has a master's in human rights and democratization in Africa from the University of Pretoria. So she also works as a guest lecturer at the University of Pretoria. Her specialty is gender, human rights, gender law and policy, decoloniality, political leadership and governance. Daphine, you can wave to us. We want to see you. And then our third facilitator is Nansiima. Nansiima is also a lecturer in the School of Women and Gender Studies, Makerere University. And she's also a coordinator of a postgraduate course on gender and local development at the School of Women and Gender Studies. She has a PhD in gender and diversity from the Free University of Brussels, and also a master's degree from Bergen, Norway. And her interest is feminist theory, gender, institutions and social transformation, gender politics and the state, gender and development management. So Anna, if you're able to wave to us, please do. So those are our
thank you, Edith.
Yeah, so you're welcome. So colleagues, those are our three facilitators, and I would like to hand over to Amon, Dr. Amon, who is going to tell us why are we here? Why are we even talking about decolonial feminist research? So over to you, Amon.
Thank you, Edith. Thank you so much for the generous introduction. Thank you, colleagues who are on the call. I want to share briefs on why we are talking about decolonial feminist research. And I want also to acknowledge that decolonization is a very contemporary discussion on the African continent. So we are doing the right thing. This conversation is aimed at enabling us to appreciate a number of concepts that appear in that conversation, beginning with decolonial feminist research and many others that we will share, but also in the long run, beginning today and going forward, build our capacities as researchers and practitioners in a number of things. And one of the key is really to promote research ethics that aim at retrieving and recentering marginalized African forms of knowledge and processes research, to promote research that is equitable and empowering, and also to look at how do we privilege contexts and experiences and voices of participants that we often marginalize. So in this broader context then, in particular, we will be having 4 objectives for this conversation. And these 4 objectives, I will request Edith to work with me to these objectives. But our intention of the listening session today is really to understand the role of colonialism and coloniality in knowledge production. We will also look at what we call the notion of epistemic injustices, the unfairness that comes through colonialism and coloniality. We will have a critique of feminist research theories from a decolonial perspective. We will examine politics of donor funding, those that sustain colonial legacies within the research agenda. And then we will look at how do we reimagine decolonial futures together through acknowledging marginalized forms of knowledge and recentering feminist research ethics. So I will take you through the listening session plan. The plan is that I will come on looking at the concepts of colonialism and coloniality and the influence of these policies or practices on knowledge production. And then after that, I will welcome Daphine Agaba, who will take us through a decolonial critique of feminist research theories. And then we will have the politics of donor funding and the influence of that on the feminist research agenda in East Africa. And then we will wrap up with reimagining the future of decolonial feminist research together. So I want to quickly take on my very brief 10 minutes of understanding the concept of colonialism and coloniality. I will particularly borrow insights from this Ugandan feminist decolonial scholar, Sylvia Tamale, who looks at colonization as a process by which we had a group of people exploiting and annexing the lands and natural resources of another group of people without their consent. And so you had, for example, much of Europe and America imposing themselves on certain communities, which we then consider as colonies, taking over their land, taking over their other resources, dictating governance structures without the consent of those communities. And of course, the process of colonization took much longer and had greater impact on societies, cultures, economies, language, and the general practice of governance. And we want to note that while we reached a level where colonized communities fought for their independence and got independence, we've had legacies of colonialism persisting and carrying on beyond the flag independence that we saw. So coloniality then is seen as that ideological system which explains the long-standing patterns of power that result from European colonialism. It is that invisible power structure that sustains colonial relations of exploitation and domination long after independence, political independence of these countries. So you will find that there are certain legacies introduced during colonialism that have persisted to date. And then we look at the concept of decoloniality, which is a type of sort of questioning and destabilizing that process of colonization or decolonizing, which looks at how do we disrupt the legacies of colonialism that manifested in form of racism, gender, and geopolitical oppression. And of course, there are many other concepts that come into this process, as we shall see, as Daphine and Anne come in. And the last concept that we want to look at is really the concept of epistemology, which is, epistemology is really about that theory of knowledge, or the philosophical view regarding how we know what we come to know. How, for example, do we learn that women are inferior to men? Through what methods or justifications or validations do we work with in the research process? So these are some of the concepts that we wanted to introduce and continue to elaborate as we go forward. I want to pick up on that, these concepts, by telling two particular stories, very short and quick ones, from the Ugandan context, Uganda and Kenya. And these are stories that come from the colonial archives that we've been working with at Makerere University on colonialism and knowledge. There is an individual that appears in these archives called Roland Oliver. And this was a colonial administrator, but at the same time, an anthropologist who rejected the work, a published document. It was called the Traditional History of Ankole. Ankole is one of the kingdoms in Uganda. And so there are two historians that put together an account of the history of this kingdom. And these were called Katate and Kamgungunu. But when Roland Oliver read this, he rejected this as a piece of knowledge, not because of its authenticity, but because of individuals that had put it together. He questioned how thorough these traditional African historians could do. And so he set out on a justification mission. He called it a justification mission because he wanted to find out whether these two indigenous historians could write a very authentic and coherent account. And of course, he did not establish any difference. And then we had E.T. Hill, who was a church missionary, a member of the Church Missionary Society, who met communities that lived between Uganda and Kenya on their border. They are called Luo or Luya. At that time, they were called Kavilondo. And he was writing to the audience in the UK, and he told them of how the Kavilondo women were extremely bad-mannered. And what he described as bad manners was that these women could walk long distances alone, they could walk along men, and they could sit amongst men and hold meaningful conversation. And he said, this is utter bad manners. And so we want to say that the experiences of colonialism often read colonized communities out of context and misrepresented these experiences in very impactful ways. If you go to the next, I look at the assumptions that colonialism then came with that led to distortion of knowledge and ways of knowing. And one of them is that the colonizer is the knower, is the origin of civilization and modernity with them, and that the rest of the colonized communities were the other, the opposite, and in need of redemption. But we also see that colonization comes with the hierarchization of social relations. The colonialists tended to look at life in a binary way, where something was good and others were bad, white and black, private and public. And in all this, the dominant position was the position of the colonizer, and the colonized was the other. And along that, we saw indigenous communities that were perceived as not knowledgeable and not knowing how to think, how to use land, how to manage themselves, how to create institutions. And because of that, colonialism came with the intent to redeem, to civilize, and to modernize. And so all these construction of the colonized communities as the other was used as the basis for colonization. And of course, along that, we see the notion, what other people have called the myth of emptiness. When they arrive, you see them discovering this, discovering that, as if there were no people around those entities that are being discovered. For instance, the discovery of Lake Victoria. And so we saw colonialism also dictating the nature and the motive of education and religions and cultures, to the level that the colonized communities' cultures and ways of learning were rejected in preference for the colonial education at DTC. And one of the examples that is given is there, Professor Sylvia Tamari in her work, talking about how the early learning level begins on a wrong note. And in notes, I have always wondered why, when we are learning, the alphabet tells us that A is for apple. When there are no apples in the tropics, how do we learn if we use examples that do not relate to our experience? And so she decries the refusal to look at communities in their own context. The next slide then, I just highlight that. I would not go through that. I look at very many processes through which colonialism negated African knowledge. That picture is showing a C-section that was performed by an indigenous healer in one of the Ugandan communities, which was rejected and refused by the colonial administrators, and all the instruments confiscated right now in European museums. So the kind of knowledge that existed in colonized communities was often rejected as not authentic and not, inauthentic, and therefore, juxtaposing colonizers' knowledge as the standard measure of understanding the world. The next. Yes, and so one of the things that we look at from those concepts and processes that we discuss is that really you look at colonialism engineering power hierarchies that position the colonizer as the most superior and authentic source of knowledge, and the colonized as the inferior and an object of research investigation, and that these unfortunate relations continue today. So I want to raise this question. In your practice of conducting research or development work that you have been doing, are there traces of colonial legacies that you have observed in your research process? I just wanted to take briefly 3 minutes. And of course, we are going to discuss this further at the end. But I want any one of you to put up their hand and share with me whether there are certain legacies of colonialism that you have encountered in your research process, in the current moment? Any thought that you want to share with us?
Dr. Amon, maybe some can also post their comments or examples in the chat box.
Yes, sure. Please feel free to raise your hand and share with us, or to type in the chat in response to this question. What traces of colonial legacies have you observed in your research process? Okay, and I do see a number of things coming up. Let me scroll through. Sarah is saying the language in which our research is shared is often colonial. That's good to point out. Anne Fiedler says academic research style and reporting. Any thoughts?
Okay, we have by Vineha.
Yeah, we have Vineha. Please, could you unmute and share?
Yeah, hello. So I think one colonial legacy may be that we don't try to actively take from, learn from the community, the practices that they have developed to combat with any issue that they are facing or how they want to develop. So the ways that they already have inculcated, those are often not documented. We come with our own agenda and then implement it. So that as well.
Thank you, Vineha. Anne Fiedler, you want to speak more to your...
I just wanted to speak to my point. I remember being part of a team that was kind of investigating on women who had received economic grants of goats. They had been given goats to keep. And so at the end of the quarter, we wanted to go and to get their report. And so the part was that they were asked a series of questions, and then they were told, where's your report? And they were forced, but they preferred to talk. They just wanted to talk through, and they were saying, oh, my goat went and ate the neighbor's crops, and then I was fined. Oh, then my goat has delivered this. So they were talking, but I remember the research team I was with then didn't want to listen to what they were saying. They were looking more for a written report. And yet these were women in the village. And instead of listening to them and probably transcribing what they were saying, they were basically intent on just getting the report.
Good. Thank you so much, Anne. And many of these examples, we need to hear them, and especially as we craft a collective way of moving towards decolonial feminist methodologies. I want to stop here and promise that we're going to take this conversation further at the end of our presentation. So I want to request Dr. Daphine Agaba to come and share with us a decolonial critique of feminist research theories. Thank you.
Amon, thank you very much for that elaborate presentation. I hope you can hear me. You know what is so funny about this internet and everything? My computer blacked out right before this meeting, and so I'm using my phone. So I hope you can still hear me. My apologies. I don't know if you also need to decolonize the internet. I don't know. We could laugh about that. Yes. So a decolonial critique of feminist research theories. So why the focus on feminist research theories? Because this is where I almost started from, but then I decided to sort of focus it, and this is why I decided to focus it. Because when you think about feminist research and research principles, they are derived from dominant research theory and methodology. So therefore, it's very important to understand the role that methodologies and methods play in persistent forms of dominant, inferior reason. I'm happy that Amon introduced us to the word epistemology, because I'm going to be talking a lot about it. And epistemology simply is, what do we know and how do we know it? So I want you to take it like that. What do we know and how do we come to know it? So therefore, we need to find ways of understanding hidden and complex phenomena, like theories in this case, that dominant methodologies use to conceal, hide, and sanitize inferior forms of reasoning and viewing and knowing and seeing the world. So that's hence the reason for that focus. And in order to, I said, well, how can we focus this further? So I decided to look at the dominant theories that are usually used in feminist research. These are three. So we have liberal feminism, we have Marxist feminism, and we have radical feminism. So starting off with liberal feminism, what is it and where does it come from? So for those who have had the chance to do feminist research, gender research, you've come across the word liberal feminism at least once in your research. In fact, for us in Makerere University, I don't think there is any thesis I've ever looked at, in master's thesis at that level, where I have not seen either liberal feminism, Marxist feminism, or radical feminism in some way, shape, or form. Those are the, whether you tell them to look for others, those are the theory students always refer to. And so this one is focused on achieving gender equality through political and legal reform. And it does this within constitutional democracies. And you know, almost all of Africa is constitutional democracy because of who colonized us. And those were the Britons. And for those who are not colonized by Britons, were colonized by French-speaking countries with a few Lusophone here and there. So for most countries that were colonized by the Britons, they have constitutions in their countries, and those are the ones that you would call rights-centered constitutions. So liberal feminism comes from that urge at the time during the 19th century by white middle-class feminists who wanted the right to vote, adult suffrage, right to access education. It was all mostly right-centered, and they wanted their rights, women's rights, to be included within the mainstream rights. So what is the critique of liberal feminism? We do not say, when we are critiquing theories, we don't say that there is anything wrong except for the fact of where do they come from. So the critique of liberal feminism is mostly to do with it originated from events that happened in the Western world and was mostly adopted by white middle-class women. That's why its theoretical orientation is to liberal democracy and human rights. And as I said before, most of our constitutions are right-centered. And I wanted to highlight this one phrase that was made by Makau Mutua. He says, by hiding their historical, theoretical, and ideological underpinning, which is essentially Western, liberal, and pretending to be universally applicable, human rights texts continue to conceal their colonial, provincialized, geographical, and epistemological nature. In other words, human rights have been sanitized of their origin and presented as a universal paradigm that applies to all. But if you strip away that sanitization, you will know where they originate from and who they applied to. Which takes me to radical feminism. Radical feminism it looks at patriarchy as a problem. And it situates this patriarchy in a class of men being oppressors of the class of women. It talks about a relationship of dominance, where one party is dominant and is exploiting the other, and the other one is the one that is being dominated. So it seeks to challenge patriarchy by challenging existing social norms and institutions. And so for it doesn't talk about changing laws and policies, legal reforms, and it talks about uprooting patriarchy, which is a system of domination, which is male dominated. So its end goal is not just elimination of male privilege, but of the sex distinction itself, the male and female, even goes as far as talking about genital differences between human beings that will no longer matter culturally. So that is patriarchy, power play, power struggles, the relationship between those who dominate and those who are dominated, and it talks about systemic oppression and marginalization. What's its critique? The critique here is going to be almost similar to the one of liberal feminism, but the first contradiction that we see here is that by talking about, despite the fact that radical feminists talked about the elimination of sex differences, they again located challenges in male domination against female subordination. So they ended up reinforcing the same binary, women and men, that they aimed to eliminate. Secondly, it's also the other problematic issue is also where does it come from? It comes from narratives by second wave feminists that were encountered by white middle and upper class. And when we're talking about the coloniality, we have to situate it not only from its origin, but also where was it. And therefore, there was a very clear absence of voices of Black women and other women of color, as well as working class women. Another critique that is raised at radical feminism is that it underplayed the differences between women. It made women all the same. Again, we are going back to the universalism principle, where it said women are being discriminated against. Which women? So when you peel back which women these are, these women were most often white middle class and upper class women. They didn't take into consideration what of the colonized women, because at the time this was happening, most of Africa was under colonization. What of Black women? What of issues of sexuality? What of young women? What of poor women? What of women who are coming from the impoverished parts of the population? So who was included in those women? So it ends up falling in that universality trap that I pointed out with the liberal feminist theory. Then we move to Marxist feminism. So Marxist feminism comes and it looks like it is going abroad, because now it's looking at capitalism. And it's saying, the problems of women are steeped within capitalism and the individual ownership of private property. So this Marxist theory, their theory was derived from Marx and Engels, who were German philosophers at the time, who grew up in the communist regime of Germany. And according to them, they say that the only way women's liberation can occur is by dismantling capitalist systems in which they condense much of women's labor happens is uncompensated. So you've heard of unpaid care work, unpaid domestic work, and then the sex relations. So the underlying philosophy of Marxism is derived from communist types of government. In fact, the early feminists found a lot of success with communist and socialist parties because their ideals lean towards the Marxist type of government. And we move to the critique. What is the critique of that theory? So even though it looks like now it's talking about capitalism, now it is addressing everyone, again, we go back to where does it originate from? Marx and Engels were both German philosophers. And the ironical thing is that at the time when this theory was coming up, most of Africa was still under active colonialism. So how did this theory apply to Africa? It had a few scholars came up like Angela Davis, who talked about women, race, and class. But ultimately, Zondi puts it perfectly when he says, Marxist feminism can be derived from principles of the Cold War, which was the war between the capitalist states and the communist states, which he calls a family feud within Western civilization. He calls it a contest between Western ideas and ideologies, liberalism and communism, into which we, the people outside the West, were drawn, unfortunately, against our will. Indeed, as nearly all the colonial states achieved independence in the period from 1945 and 1960, many became third world battlefields in the Cold War. And how do you see that happening today? Today, you see us blindly adopting policy. We are still in that position where we are still policy takers rather than policy makers, because most of our policies, either directly or indirectly, come from outside of the region. So what have been the attempts to decolonize feminist theories? Several, of course, Africans are not passively watching what is happening. There have been a few attempts to decolonize feminist theories. These are by no means exhaustive, but I put here a few of them. One, we can talk about African feminism. This is the different ways in which African scholars, African activists, African practitioners have decided to write themselves into the conversation. They've talked about recognizing their histories, their present realities, and their future expectations. So they don't only concern themselves with voices of women from Africa, but also those living in the diaspora as contributors to the literature. Another one has been intersectionality. So this theory was framed first by Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black scholar from the US. And the reason why she coined this theory, she was very perturbed by the way in which white mainstream feminists constructed the conversation away from the experiences of Black women. Racialized Black women with a history of slavery, Black women. Now, when you extend it further to now Black women from the colonized states. And so she emphasized the use of the acknowledgement of the multiple overlapping and contradictory systems of power that shape our lives and political options. And when you see that table, you look at how a woman's life can be shaped by so many circumstances and issues around them. They're not just one factor. It can be gender, it can be education, it can be ethnicity, it can be culture, name it. The whole panoply of those. Then we also have African ecofeminism. This one is built on the belief that women have a special relationship with nature. And I know some of you have heard about Wangari Maathai and her contribution to this ecofeminism conversation. So it is the belief that we are not separate from or important than the natural world around us. We are in fact part of it, but however, we have a current environmental crisis which is caused by the modern ways of producing food, of producing energy, and the consumption habits. So they steep most of the problems of the environment with capitalism, with colonialism, with patriarchy. So with all this, you see it being more intersectional, more broad, more inclusive, because that is what the African conversation, the decoloniality conversation is about. Then third world feminism is also a bit similar to what I talked about, the principles above of intersectionality, because it came during the second wave feminism and it was in line with the exclusion of Black women from the conversation. So they wanted their voices to be included, and the multiple ways in which they were oppressed, which were different from those of the mainstream white women. This same theory rejected the principle of false universalism, which I've already talked about. We talked about women being the same and embraced the intersecting oppressions and multiple forms of resistance. So, having mentioned a few of those, what are some of the practical approaches to decolonizing feminist research? One, we have to move away from blindly consuming theories that are removed from the African lived experience. In this case, theories, principles, methodologies, to creating and innovating contextualized ones. And then another thing we have to do is prioritize diversity and get comfortable with it. There's a lot of binarizing when it comes to Eurocentric forms of feminism. Men, women, developed versus developing, capitalism versus socialism. On the contrary, most indigenous practices from African communities are very comfortable with numerous ways of being, and they have adapted ironies into their existence. We exist with multiple languages, we exist with multiple cultures, we exist with multiple practices, and we've learned how to exist amicably with them and make peace with them. The other one, which I've kept on emphasizing, is being wary of universalism. And this one, Maldonado Torres calls it epistemic racism, where Europe and its North American counterparts have made themselves the only authors and arbiters of authentic thinking. This notion is kept alive by Western authors and African elites who have been trained as experts in Western thinking. And so they dispute, they provincialize, they subsume, they negate, they undermine any knowledge that is produced or arises from the periphery. The other practical way is one that was proposed by Gumede, a scholar from South Africa, who talked about thought liberation. That is a call for rediscovery of self as Africans. You know, he talks about the fact that Africans have internalized self-esteem after so many years of colonialism and neocolonialism and metacolonialism. So he talks about a rediscovery of ourselves as an individual capable of producing progressive thought, action, as well as achievement. He also talks about critical consciousness, which is the ability to analyze and perceive economic, political, and social contradictions, but also take action against those oppressive elements. Then the other one is to prioritize the search for peripherized, othered, indigenous ways of being and ensure that we center them, because coloniality is about decentering marginalized voices and having this one voice that almost speaks for everyone. Then there is epistemic disobedience. This one, as an academic, I have to say, it requires a certain kind of bravery. Because of all the work we have to do as academics, because of all the hectic works we have to do as academics, you find that epistemic disobedience is a difficult task to undertake. Sometimes you're alone, sometimes you're the lone voice in the field. So because you also have to get your life on and you have to earn a salary and you have to keep your job at the university, researchers in the African context and practitioners in the African context often end up taking the easier route of conformity with whatever is available. Epistemic disobedience is not an easy task to take on. Then the last but not least is to emphasize contextualization. Always look at things and say, how do they apply to my context? Sometimes referred to as localization of research studies. Are these research applicable to the context in which I live? Can they be applied in this context in which I live? So to finish that off, I wanted us to identify one or two, maybe in the 5 minutes we have, persistent Eurocentric things in our research. This could be in data collection for those who have conducted research. This could be in research methodology if you've come across any of those. This could even be in theories of research. This could also be in when you do research work. What kind of things have you seen when you go to collect data, or when you're trying to organize processes, when you're trying to compile reports? What kind of themes have you identified? And most of them might not be direct, but they might be subtle. But could you identify any of those?
So thank you so much, Dr. Agaba. I think I encourage fellows to put your comments, your suggestions in the chat box. Maybe for those who are not able to raise your hands. For those who can raise your hand, you can raise your hand. Thank you.
Okay. You know, when you come from a teaching background and then you teach and no one asks questions, you always assume no one understood what you're teaching about. But I'll just presume we're still reflecting on the presentation. Oh, yes, I see someone in the chat box here. No, this one is talking about, okay, someone is just commending the presentation and saying very empowering conversation. Okay, yeah, just a comment. Thank you very much, Moses. Okay. And also, this question is going to come back towards at the end, so we can keep thinking about it and maybe raise it as we continue. Any comments? Any questions? Any issues?
I think we can allow Dr. Nansiima to take on the floor, and then we can go back to that later.
Okay. Someone has said, right before she takes it on, someone has said our categories of gender are quite binary, even when the research claims to be feminist. Then someone talked about local opinions are not regarded as high enough evidence, yet the higher level evidence is highly colonized. Thank you. We shall carry on this discussion later. So for now, we can move on to Dr. Anna.
Thank you so much, Daphine. Thank you so much, Amon. Thank you, the organizers. This is Anna Nansiima. And I am going to take us through donor funding and its influence on the feminist research agenda in East Africa and Africa generally. So from colonial concepts like breadwinner, in Africa, we don't eat bread, but we use the concept breadwinner, to theory that Daphine has taken us through, and now compounded with the donor funding. We want to see how all this may work out together to influence knowledge production and therefore to influence our research. So when we are dealing with funding, we realize that I shouldn't say maybe quite often, I think all the time, we find that there are donor-driven agendas in terms of research. Normally the agenda is set by the one who brings the money, they set the agenda, they set the objectives of research, and sometimes, or most times, it actually reflects their interests. There is always hierarchy in terms of who is the knower, who is the expert, who is the consultant, and who builds the capacity for the local people. And even particularly on issues like poverty, issues like gender-based violence in Africa. So you find that the expert is not actually from Africa. And of course, this raises issues of positionality. I mean, we also, in our research, we have had this issue of positivism. We measure everything. We even measure gender norms. We assume that everything must be measured. And I think I'll not go into the details, but then we forget that there are stories, there are experiences of people that really we need to capture, that are very, very critical, especially when we are doing gender studies. I shouldn't even talk about theory because Daphine has done justice, but I also want to talk about the issues that we do, like the theory of change. If you are, most times, I think most of you, if you're working with NGOs, you find that if we are working on gender-based violence, and the theory of change is coming from somewhere. If, for example, you're talking about GBV shelters, and you find that because it has worked in the US, therefore that is the theory of change that will also be applicable to East Africa. And I think most of the times, because of context, you find that people have nowhere to go after the shelters. So you have to look at the context of what is happening. How are the shelters working in other countries? If they have been successful in other countries, are they likely to also be successful in our context, depending on the issues that we face? Who builds the theory? I shouldn't go into that, but I want to look at the politics of publication and how, therefore, this affects what kind of knowledge do we access. Normally, open access is very, very, very expensive for us in the academia, and those of you who are in research, to be able to publish in open access. Open access means that you publish in a journal, and this is open for everyone to read. So you find that most of the information that is written by Africans or East Africans may not easily get into open access because open access is quite expensive. But also, the politics of publication also matter in terms of what kind of matter are you producing? How acceptable is it to the powers that be? I remember one of the organizations doing research on human development, and this was funded by World Bank. And World Bank resisted. They said they could not publish the research that came out because it contradicted what they already knew. In other words, that the education, they thought the education was doing well, health was doing fine, water and everything, and they couldn't believe the data that came from the field. And so they refused to publish it. So that shows you that there's a lot of politics in terms of not only open access, but also in terms of the content of what you actually. Next slide, please. We want to talk about, I want to dwell so much on how this donor funding actually influences research. I realize that there is a lot of funding that comes to East Africa and to other African countries, but sometimes you do not see the match in terms of expected long-term changes and social transformation. And I normally say that, why do we all the time when we are writing, we start by saying globally the disease burden is this, but it's worse in sub-Saharan Africa. Globally, gender-based violence is this, but it's worse. So basically you find that almost every conflict, almost everything ends with sub-Saharan Africa being more problematic. And I pose a question, why? Do we as researchers, next slide, do we as researchers ever ask ourselves why this is the norm? Why we have kept this normative?
Dr. Anna, we can't hear you anymore. Seem to have lost Dr. Anna. Let's try to reach her later on. So Dr. Daphine, can we, as we wait for her,
Yes. Yeah. Can we? Pardon? Can we?
Yeah, I think we've lost her, so we need to.
Yes. Yeah. So as we wait for Dr. Anna, I just wanted us to think about if anyone who has had the opportunity to be here today present, and I don't want you to feel like you're being called out. At one, I would like us to start identifying at least one insight that you picked from today that you think you're going to go back with after today, in whichever field you think you might be in, whether you're in research work, whether you're in project work, whether you're in care work, whether you're in
I am back.
Yes, okay.
Sorry, sorry about that. It was I was asking that somebody could move to the next slide.
Seems to be the next slide, I think. Okay, maybe. Let me see. Is this the one?
Okay, yes, yes. So we are saying that we have neglected the context. We have tended to focus on individual rights, and we have forgotten the global economic political forces that impoverish women and men. And this is not to say that human rights are not good, but do we have the conditions for people to be able to comprehend rights? What are the issues that we normally preoccupy us? We talk about maternal mortality. These are issues we talk about every day. We talk about infant mortality. We talk about issues happening in the hospitals. These, I mean, when you look at what's happening in our healthcare system, you wouldn't be questioning why maternal mortality and infant mortality is high. We talk about early pregnancies and marriage. We talk about girls being trafficked to Dubai and UAE countries. Can we really divorce these issues from the economy and the governance? Can we divorce this from economic deprivation as a primary factor for example, sexual and reproductive health violations of young women as a reason for gender-based violence, mainly as a reason for high maternal mortality as a result of poor healthcare system? So when you look at all these issues that are amongst us, we clearly see institutional failure. And I think that rather than focus on, as researchers, we fail to focus on the cause for institutional failure and poverty, but we instead focus on norms and culture. We identify bride wealth as a problem and think that bride wealth is the cause of gender-based violence, and raise without understanding what bride wealth is and how it has been influenced by colonialism, how its meaning changed. So when we identify these issues, we fail to understand the institutional failure, but instead identify norms and culture solely without understanding the context into which we are operating. Then our prescription becomes sensitization without understanding that the structural adjustment programs which mandated governments to cut subsidies, to reduce spending on social services like health and education, that these are responsible for institutional failure in developing countries. Yet, the power relations terrain reduces researchers' freedom in the global south, affecting the production of liberatory knowledge, silencing African experiences. I recently was involved in a project. I recently was involved in a project where we were looking at gender, youth, and social inclusion, and whether these different categories of people access family health care. We found that the real problem why women, the disabled, the key populations were not accessing good health care was largely because of poor service delivery as a result of poor healthcare system. When we submitted the report highlighting the problem and recommending, for example, improving infrastructure for the disabled, motivating healthcare workers, training healthcare workers in gender and youth inclusion, and of course, identifying other problems that we found on ground, like people may be lacking transport, the expert, the advisor, referred us to a certain report by saying that we missed out on gender issues, that the gender issues were not captured. We argued that this is not what we found on the ground. Women did not report that their husbands
Dr. Agaba, I think you need to come in here.
Yeah.
Yes, to move us to the next session.
Yes.
Also in the
Dr. Yeah, Dr. Anna, we have to stop you there because we keep losing you and we also have to keep to the time. I hope she doesn't come back and start from where she ended. You know, when your network is good, you can't even hear what has been decided in line with you, what you've been presenting. But basically, what our next takeaway from this is basically to look at how do we proceed with this. Other than that, one would wonder, why have we got the information? What is the way forward? What are some of the tangible ways we can start rethinking research and rethinking practice, which are two related aspects? And so for me, what I had started on, I had wanted to request those who are here, if you could type into the chat box, or if you could raise your hand and tell us one insight that you, or lesson that you picked from today that you think you will either directly or indirectly either incorporate in your work, or you will at least think about while doing your work. So just to repeat, I would like us to either type in the chat box or raise your hands if you can, about one lesson or insight you think you have picked from this discussion today, of which you think you can either incorporate in your work or you can at least think about. In other words, what there's that thing where they say, what are we going to do differently? Don't beat. Yes. Anna, can we mute Anna? So yes, so because we've been talking all this time, I would like to hear from the audience that has been here. What are some of the insights you picked from today? What are some of the lessons? What is have you thought about and said, oh, I never thought about that. I've never related that to that. And how do you think you can carry that forward or even think about it as we implement the kind of work we do, wherever you are, by the way, it doesn't matter where you are.
Someone has the hand up, John King.
John King, I can't see, by the way, I can't see hands from where I am. So maybe,
okay.
Yes, if you will help me with that.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes, first of all, to say thank you for this presentation. Some of it went missing, but I picked up a few things, one of which was how important it is to look at the context. I work with the Fidelitas, and our work revolves around looking at implementation of science, also doing research work, especially on social norms. We were sub-grantees for social norms exploration exercise sometime last year. So we learned quite a lot. So looking at the context of what we are doing is very, very important. I want to agree with the researcher on that one. And it's something that we would like to contextualize and also concretize in our work at Fidelitas. So I just wanted to share that part.
Okay. Thank you very much, John. So you're talking about contextualization. Maybe, and also we are going to start to learn to even specify further when we talk about contextualization. How can we do it practically so that we can go away with a bit of a more, for instance, if you, John, if you don't mind me asking, what kind of research work do you do, or what is your area of focus?
Yes, our area of focus is we're looking at very Afrocentric kind of issues. Most recent has been looking at the social norms that affect and impact the incidence of diabetes type 2. And we're looking at areas of Lango, Teso, Busia, and Busoga. And so when we talk about contextualization, we look at those areas and look at cultural norms as they affect individual behavior. So we do behavioral research and look at those issues. We also look at, we do research on cultural behaviors, cultural norms that affect things.
Yes.
That's our main focus.
Anyway, you've collected research in ways that take into consideration local context, because sometimes how we do this research also matters. How do we collect research? Do we follow the methods that we know? Are there methods we incorporate that help to capture those marginalized voices?
Yes, we do that actually. When we do research, we try to first of all redesign tools to the effect that they are able to help us understand the local context. If you're doing work in Lango, if you're doing work in Busia, there are some very cultural specific issues that you need to capture. So our tools are kind of like flexible to capture such data, and we're able to kind of like look at its data in a more specific manner.
Yes.
So look at that specific. Yeah.
Thank you very much, John King. And the reason why I'm asking that is, you know, students always go for data collection. And when they come back, they tell you, we used focus group discussion, we used key informant interviews, we used in-depth interviews, and then you ask them, why did you use focus group discussions? And sometimes they can't tell you why. But because maybe someone, some research they copy pasted, by the copy pasting is also one of the lazy research. They put it there just for the purpose of putting there. So even rethinking how we get the information we get, because the way we get that information can end up actually excluding certain parts of our local communities. And so I see here Violent Linda has said, my view is that until we start valuing evidence and start raising our own funds for research within the country, it is self-deficit to talk about decolonization. Well, that is a very good point. Any other reflections or thoughts? What are we going to do differently as we talk about, Violent is talking about a self-funding, looking for funding within. And then she's also talking about, then Anne has asked a question here. She's asked, how can our research academics decolonize their minds and methods? I think part of the problem is here. This is a very good question. How can research academics, because research academics essentially transfer knowledge to students, how can they decolonize their minds? Amon, do you think you have a contribution here? How, from what you've seen in the academic environment, do you think research academics are starting to do the work to decolonize their minds?
Okay, yeah, I managed. I was trying to switch on. Yeah, I think that there is deliberate effort to try to decolonize the mind. And I think this has started with rethinking the methodologies that we work with. If I can give an example of what has been going on at Makerere University for the last 3 to 5 years, it has been asking ourselves, what value is it to return to history as a mechanism of knowing the past, but also to inform the present? And it is through that effort, there is a research project on historicizing humanity. Yes. And so a number of researchers were tasked to look back into the history of their disciplines, history of gender, history of philosophy. And it has been quite interesting to look at how the contemporary relations were crafted through a very, unequal foundation of colonialism. So at times you might look at, everyday ways of representing women as weak, vulnerable, and subordinate to men. Yes. And you do not understand where this began from. But going back into the history and meeting experiences of very creative, hardworking women who were forced into domestic spaces under colonial regimes of men going into plantation agriculture and women staying home. And looking at experiences of those hardworking women being looked at as unwomanly. We started to see what could explain the contemporary uncomfortable experiences that we see. So we may not be there, but the thinking is shifting in terms of how do we look at the contemporary relations? How do we reimagine women's power, women's agency, without necessarily looking at everybody as weak and helpless? There is no woman now you can find in the household, if you go to Lango, which has been talked about, that will be folding hands and waiting for the husband to bring food. They are in the field, they are working, they are contributing to the economy. So the thinking is changing.
Okay, thank you very much. So historicizing, always asking ourselves, where is this information coming from? By the way, by removing history from documents, we have presented them as universal documents. So always asking any information we have, where does it come from and in which context did this information apply? And then someone has asked here in the comment section, must all research require funds? Are there studies that can be conducted without funds? Does this have design implications? Maybe colonial methods are expensive. And this reminds me of, in Uganda, people like saying, tusaba government to yambe. Loosely translated, we are asking for help from government. it's that thing of always thinking that everything we might do, we have to do, has to require funds. And when we attach funds to everything we do, then we can't do anything unless we are not funded. So are there studies that can be conducted without funds? Are there studies that are already ongoing without funds, but because they don't have funds, we are not considering them to be important? Is there knowledge? And also, we also have to understand what knowledge do we always use as authentic knowledge, and knowledge that is not authentic. I mean, that is why you see people coming all over from wherever they come from and discovering places where people have lived for years, discovered the source of the Nile. Were there animals living there? So this research might be there, but because it's not recorded somewhere, there is the perception that it's non-existent. Then Violent has talked about, my point of reflection or takeaway is, how do we frame the research problems, especially when we situate them in the global realms? And that goes back to what Anna Nansiima was talking about, how we always start from globally, however, and then we compare it. And always the comparison is diminished. The comparison is always marginalized. The comparison, every time you compare with Sub-Saharan Africa, even the name Sub-Saharan Africa itself is a discussion for another day. And recently, when we were attending research, I noticed that even when people, if you notice research, people always start from the background and they say globally. And I was wondering, someone is doing something on drama in Uganda, and they're still saying drama came from Greece. And I'm like, really? Is this where we're going to situate this study? So we also have to, yes.
Actually, I wouldn't have a problem with talking about the situation globally, but I think we need to question ourselves why every problem delights itself in Sub-Saharan or whatever. In this case, we're talking about East Africa.
Yes.
Why is every problem delighting itself in this area? And when we ask such hard questions, then we should be able to identify something so common that is in these countries that we need to deal with. That way, we are dealing with the root cause of the problem rather than dealing with the symptoms. That's my point, basically.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna. And then someone asked, is there any way we can use our own history and background to build our own understanding and standard of feminism that will include everyone in the society, from the most privileged woman to the unprivileged one who wasn't lucky enough to step into a classroom, where the voices of the people we always call the illiterates, where the indigenous voices, where the community voices, and someone is talking about centering those histories and backgrounds in order to build our own understanding and standard of feminism. Yeah. Then someone talks about adding to this is that people look at research as a one-time event, and then hence think of how data can be collected at large scale within a defined period. If it is something seen as day-to-day way of gathering, analyzing information, then it may not really be expensive as we think. So you conduct your research and you say, I'm going to conduct it for 1 year. It's a one-off. I'm going to go and conduct a baseline survey. I'm going to conduct it from 2021 to 2023. And then you go and conduct it as a one-off event, as if the events you're looking at have ended with that research. So he's talking about how do we incorporate research in our day-to-day activities. And also, when we talk about evidence-based, this has always bothered me. When you talk about evidence-based research, whose evidence?
Whose evidence?
Yes.
And who measures the evidence that this is quality evidence?
Yes. I have very many.
Who decides that this is now evidence?
Yes.
So that is also a problem.
Evidence. Yeah. So it is literally centering the often peripherized voices, often marginalized voices, often indigenous voices, who we, by the way, always assume that they don't have knowledge. When you go to collect research, the kind of ways we collect that research, are we assuming that the people don't have enough knowledge about the issue we are looking at? From which element are we empowering the people from whom? Is it a relational thing, or it's a thing where one is above the other? As researchers, our positionality, that one is another one. What is our positionality in research? I remember very many times for say talking about I'm so and so, I'm from Kampala, I am literate, and I acknowledge my privilege. What privilege do you cover when you go to conduct this research? what privilege do you cover when you're doing research in Africa as someone who is actually not from Africa? So it is all those things to look at when we think about research, but research can be an ongoing thing, as Moses has talked, and not a one-off thing. Then someone has talked about, we treasure feedback from our audience. Okay, so someone is asking if you'd like to have another conversation on the same topic. Please put a comment in the chat box to confirm, confirm what you'd like to hear. So your feedback is very important, but and being cognizant of time, I recognize that it's right now it is 4 p.m. and just to wrap up, and as I call Edith to briefly tell us about way forward, is one, the purpose of these decolonial feminist sessions was, one, to start understanding what is decoloniality, what is coloniality, how is it embedded in the kind of research we do, then how does research funding affect or keep coloniality practices going. It was to make us think, even think differently about the kind of work we do or wherever we are. And then it was also meant for us to think what are the persistent ways in which colonial Eurocentric forms of knowing still hide themselves in the kind of work, be it research, in the kind of projects that we do, and how can we ensure that the research we do is localized, is contextualized, directly addresses the problems of our communities, or not even the problems, because I'm assuming they are problems, addresses the issues we find ourselves in our communities. I would like to thank you so much for your listening. I'd like to thank you so much for your rich feedback. And if there is popular demand, and if you want it, we can have other sessions in line with this, touching on very many different topics. Decoloniality, we can't finish it in one day. When they gave us this topic, we wondered how we're going to approach it. It's so huge. It has so many aspects. You can talk about decoloniality in health, in political systems, in social systems. You know, you can enlarge it as much as you want. But what I also want to talk about is, as we talk about decoloniality, we also have to talk about innovating and being creative and being more of makers of policies, of theories, rather than just takers of these policies. So I would like to end there, and thank you very much, and then hand over the microphone to Eddie.
Thank you so much, Dr. Agaba, and the other facilitators, Anna and Amon. We really, really appreciate this session. There's been so much information shared with all of us, and I must confess I've learned a lot from your presentations. The question we put out there to you is whether you think that we should have another session, because a lot of what we've had today is really to give us the perspectives. But I'm thinking that maybe members have, you know, some needs, or you want maybe a further discussion on basically to share more experiences. So if this is what you really want, please confirm with us in the chat box. We put a question there to you, and we're asking if you want to have another session. You could even give ideas on how this can be structured, but I'm thinking probably it will allow us to have more experience sharing and maybe even more field experiences from practitioners and also from researchers. Yeah, so please do confirm. Otherwise, we've come to the top of the hour, and we just want to thank you for your active participation. I know this is a very busy time, lots of workshops, lots of meetings. You're all busy, but you've made time to be with us. Please do not forget to register with us in case you're interested in being part of the Eastern Africa Agency Social and Gender Norms Learning Collaborative. This is the kind of conversations we are having, basically to enrich you as an individual and your organization, so that you don't work in silos, but you can actually be part of a community where you can learn and share perspectives with others. We put out the link in the chat box. And yeah, I think my colleague Aloysius has again posted it. Please, if you're not a member and you're interested, please join. And you can also visit our LinkedIn page. Eastern Africa Agency, Social Norms and Gender Learning Collaborative, you look out for it, and then in there you'll find a registration link.
We have
Someone
so many
wanted-
activities, yeah, that are upcoming. We have these webinars are going to continue where we're going to be presenting, not necessarily on decoloniality, but on different areas of gender and social norms throughout the year. So there's so much to get as a member of this learning collaborative. This is just, actually, this is the beginning. So sign on for that. We have so many engaging webinars and conferences, and want you to even be part and present. We also have other opportunities where you can participate actively as members. You can work together with other members to work on projects and funds for the future, basically to give yourself urgency in a way. So please sign on and join us.
So thank you. And we want to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of us joining from the different parts of the world, and we wish you all the best. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much for the presentation.